McMullen's in the house. We got a little NFL, a little Eagles to continue the conversation here on 97.3 ESPN. Mike Gill taking you the rest of the way. Tomorrow we're live at Chickies in Atlantic City. Stop on out and see us. A lot to dive into on the show. There's so much going on. A lot, John, people seem to forget there's a game this weekend, right?
There is a game in New Orleans, I believe. A rematch of another game that happened in November.
That's right.
That the Eagles lost, I believe, by 41 points.
Yes, 48-7 was. Now, you wrote about this the other day about how, 7 weeks later, are the Eagles kind of outwardly talking about revenge here?
No, not really. In fact, they've kind of downplayed that. Everyone, if you remember, Saints kind of ran it up on the Eagles, and probably the most famous part of that was the 4th and 6, where they called the wheel route to Alvin Kamara on Malcolm Jenkins, and he flashed the middle finger at Sean Payton. So Malcolm was not happy at the time. The score was 38-7 at that time. So they were clearly running it up. But it's a weird dynamic because Sean Payton and Doug Peterson are really close friends. You remember they had those pair of golf bets where Doug kept beating him on the golf course. Malcolm Jenkins has tremendous respect for Sean Payton. So it's more of a competitive thing, and they were trying to get the best of their friends than any sort of ill-tempered or ill will. So I don't know if there's any want to get back because they lost that game so badly. I think from the Eagles' perspective, it just was one of those days, and the snowball was coming down the hill, and they couldn't stop it.
Yeah, I mean, that whole situation with Malcolm, he gave them the finger, and then, he played there, and he kind of discussed that at all this week, and I know he was just he was more upset with the team and the way that they played, but, I mean, there's obvious that he didn't appreciate the way that they were perceived to run it up on them.
Yeah, I mean, I think he was upset as a competitor. I think he was he mentioned after the game that he was upset about the demeanor and the effort of some of his teammates at the time.
Yeah.
But
many of which you are not a part of this week's game plan.
Yeah. They had that was the game they had so many injuries in game in the secondary. And that was it will forever be known as the Chandon Sullivan, Devontae Ballsby, Crevan LeBlanc game. And LeBlanc has been sort of a star. I don't know star, but Jim Schwartz said he saved the season. But that was his first game. So he was kind of just thrown into the mix. He didn't know the defense at all. So it was a mess. And I think that had more to do with the blowout than anything else. But from Malcolm's perspective, he likes Sean Payton. And I think it's more of his friend got the better of him, so to speak, and he didn't like that, and he'd like to turn it around this time.
Before we dive a little bit into this game and some of the storylines, I do want to play this bite for you, John, and get your reaction. This is Adam Schefter on the Adam Schefter podcast talking about Carson Wentz. Take a listen.
Carson Wentz is a transcendent talent. What Nick Foles has done has been incredible. I still cannot imagine in my mind that the Eagles would ever part ways with Carson Wentz and trade him away. Saying that, whether it's Jacksonville or Miami or any team with a quarterback need or question, they would offer their rosters for Carson Wentz. I have had people talk about this to me, GMs, wondering out loud what the price would be. And you would not believe some of the discussions that I've had about that. In a hypothetical sense, Hall of Fame players back for Carson Wentz.
Hall of Fame players offering their rosters. At what point do the Eagles have to listen if somebody calls?
Well, it's interesting because as the days go by and sort of the silly season heats up and the hyperbole heats up, there was another writer today who said teams would be going after Nick Foles in sort of a Reggie White-like frenzy. It's getting to that point of absurdity. and the Eagles are going to take advantage of it, whichever way it happens. And I've said on this show, the only way it deters away from Carson Wentz and he gets put on the trade market is if Nick Foles makes another Super Bowl. If he wins another Super Bowl, you simply can't move on from him. And then maybe they entertain it. Although even in that situation, I think they would try to make this thing last one more year before ultimately extending Carson Wentz. I don't think they're going to trade Carson Wentz. I think he's going to be the quarterback here next year. I think Nick Foles is going to get traded, and it's a matter of how crazy people get. And you look at, I think the first guy you look at is Mike Mayock now in Oakland because he's always been a big Nick Foles guy. He's a Philadelphia guy, and he's maybe – you talk about all the first-round picks and all the extra assets they got from trading Khalil Mack and Amari Cooper. Maybe he can fleece the Oakland Raiders.
Yeah, well, there's some reports today that Mayock is, interested, and they have 3 first-round picks. Actually, more so interested in Foles than Wentz, I should say.
Yeah, Foles. Yeah. Now, I don't think they're going to. I don't think there's any situation short of Nick Foles winning a second consecutive Super Bowl where they're looking to trade Carson Wentz. And even that, I think the likely path forward there is they try to push it off another year. And by the time you get another year down the road, they'll be back in the Carson Wentz camp. And I just don't think that's going to happen, even if people dangle what did Adam call it? Hall of Fame players.
Yeah.
I don't know how many Hall of Fame players.
But offer half your roster. He mentioned that some GMs had said.
Yeah, well, that's called hyperbole.
Well, but when you get to a point where there's a player of that magnitude that is available, which you don't see in the NFL that often, right?
No, and there's a reason. And if somebody's willing to offer,
especially at that position.
Much, yeah, and if somebody's willing to offer that much for a quarterback, you're not getting rid of that quarterback. That's just sort of solidifying the Eagles' mentality and how it's been and how they haven't wavered from Carson Wentz. That's part of the reason, because they know what his ceiling is. They know it better than anyone else. They see him every day, and they're just not going to move on from Carson Wentz.
Mm-hmm. Well, this week, obviously, you have Foles playing against Breeze, which is a matchup in itself. They both went to the same high school. It's the first time 2 guys that were MVP from the same high school. Now, they have played before in the 2013 game, and, both these guys have come a long way since then. But when you look at Foles, they scored 16 points last week, John. People act like because they have Foles, they just automatically win, but 16 points, not going to get it done against the Saints, right?
No, but they played the best defense in the NFL. Arguably, I would say they're the best in Chicago. The Saints are not nearly as effective defensively, and I think we always talk about the personalities of games. This game's going to have a different personality, and I think if the Eagles are to win it, they're going to score a lot of points. They're going to score 34 points, maybe win a 31 game. But certainly, if for some reason they can't move the football and they score 16, they don't have a shot against this team. There's no way you're keeping New Orleans to under 16 at the Superdome on the fast track and all their weapons and a Hall of Fame quarterback. It's going to be a completely different game.
Well, you could say it's going to be a completely different game. It's going to need to be for the Eagles from the last time these two teams played. What is something that happened in the last game that the Eagles can improve and maybe eliminate or at least take down from the last time they played?
Well, I don't even and I said it way back on, I think the week after on Mosher, McMullen, and Krause. I said that's a tape. That's a film you sort of just throw out. You don't even bother looking at. I don't think it's very relevant. At the time, the Eagles were I mentioned the names. That's who they were playing at cornerback. They got Rasul Douglas and Monte Maddox got hurt in the game. You're already talking about Jalen Mills, Ronald Darby. We know how many corners they've lost. LeBlanc, I believe that was his first game as an Eagle, being picked up on waivers earlier in the week. It's a completely different team from a secondary standpoint. And the best example of that is last week's game in Chicago, where because of Tariq Cohen, the vast majority of the game, Jim Schwartz played in big nickel, which is when he has 6 defensive backs on the field. He didn't even have 4 defensive backs to throw out against New Orleans last time that he had confidence in. Now he's throwing 6 out there on purpose because that's how much Rasul Douglas and Avonte Maddox and Cre'Von LeBlanc and even Trey Sullivan have improved since that game.
Definitely a different look in the secondary from when they were in New Orleans Week 11 in the NFL. John McMullen here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline at JF McMullen. You know, the Saints since that game, I don't want to say that they've been off a little bit, but they had the game against Carolina where I think they scored 12 points. They had the loss against Dallas. I mean, what has been different about the Saints? Do they seem to be as big and bad as they seemed like they were in Week 11 when, after they beat the Eagles that game, people were easily touting them as the best team?
Yeah, I think they scored before that game. I think they scored 40, including that game, 6 times since. They haven't scored 40 again. You mentioned the Dallas game, the Carolina game. It was really the Cowboys game. I think that's what happens in this league. Somebody kind of figures you out, and everybody else replicates it. I don't know if they figured the Saints out because they can still put up points when they're playing effectively. But I think the game plan is pretty clear, and that's you do as much as possible. Double team Michael Thomas. You're always aware of Alvin Kamara out of the backfield, and you make somebody else beat you. And if somebody else can beat you, you say, okay, and you tip your cap to them. But you can't let those 2 particular players go nuts and go off like they were doing early in the season. And I think that's where people have sort of hunkered down against the Saints, and they've been forcing other players to beat them.
Yeah.
And the other players, obviously, the other playmakers aren't as good.
Alshon Jeffrey limited today. Any concern there? Along with Golden Tate, by the way.
I don't think so. It's a walkthrough, so remember, everything's estimated today. You saw a few new. Golden Tate was on there as well. Yeah, DJ Alexander was back. I think it was more positive than negative because the only 2 players who didn't practice were Carson Wentz and I think Michael Bennett. All this is an estimation.
Michael Bennett was the most popular guy at the Sixers game last night, by the way.
Yeah, well, he's played great, and everybody has finally figured that out. Although if they were listening to our show, Mike, they would have known that from week 1. Because I told them how good a player Michael Bennett was.
That's right. Bennett has been excellent. He's been very good. Although I think one of the keys, forget Foles, part of the keys of the last 3 weeks in the playoff game was, I think their defensive line has been memorably impactful as opposed to maybe they were good, just not memorably good.
Well, I think as you get to these key important games, you start to shorten the rotation, so to speak, and you only have the good players on the field. So I think a lot of it has to do with that because when the Eagles do put Fletcher Cox and Bennett and Brandon Graham and Chris Long on the field together, that's their best foursome, and that's pretty good. That's pretty difficult to stop. Mm-hmm. So you saw the same thing happen last year. Look at Fletcher Cox's snap numbers during the season. They got much, much higher from a percentage standpoint as the season got later and later because you want your best players on the field. That's why you sort of put them on a pitch count early in the season. So they're as healthy and have as much energy as possible when you get into the real high-stakes environment.
John, a couple of NFL notes real quick. There's some new head coaches. Freddie Kitchens in Cleveland. Greg Williams is out. I would imagine. I thought that would have been odd to ask him to go back to be the defensive coordinator.
Yeah, tough situation for Greg Williams, who obviously did a very good job as the interim coach there. I think it's interesting from his standpoint. I mean, he's an egomaniac. He claimed he could have had 8 jobs anyway, so he should be able to get another job. But the whole mentality with these young quarterbacks now is Freddie Kitchens did a good job with Baker Mayfield, so you have to stay the course. Part of it I understand, because the last thing you want to do with young quarterbacks is keep changing coordinators, play callers, if it's an offensive head coach. But at the same time, if it's not broke, why are you fixing it?
Now you're just weakening your
Greg
defense.
Williams I mean, it's not like other teams were knocking down the door for Freddie Kitchens to make him a head coach. I think they should have stayed status quo.
No doubt.
You got a good defensive mind, and you're able to keep the offensive mind. So, yeah, I don't understand it other than to placate Baker Mayfield, and that's not I mean, he's a good young quarterback. He's the face of that franchise, but you got to be smarter than that as an organization.
Well, it could be interesting because Vic Fangio, he's the new head coach in Denver. Gary Kubiak will be his new offensive coordinator. It almost seems like Fangio was given an offensive coordinator, but that means Fangio's spot is open in Chicago, and you wonder if Williams could end up in Chicago.
It's possible. I mean, there's also talk of Ed Donatel just being promoted, who was their secondary coach, to keep it going as seamlessly as possible. Vic is a really good defensive coordinator. You got the 3-4 versus 4-3 issue you got to deal with, which I don't think is as important as it used to be, because most coordinators use multiple fronts now. But I mean, it's a potential, especially if you want a bigger name. But I think Chicago's going to try to keep it in-house, and we'll see how that shakes out. There's no doubt, though, Gary Kubiak's very close to John Elway. So, I mean, yeah, there's no question. Any coach that was coming in there, if he wanted Gary Kubiak to be the offensive coordinator, they were going to have to accept that.
Yeah, Kevin Stefanski is now the offensive coordinator. He's going to stay there. Also, Todd Bowles, he'll be the new defensive coordinator in Tampa. You will have Byron Leftwich calling plays in Tampa for Bruce Arians, who got that job yesterday. So we're starting to see a lot of these jobs kind of fill up all of a sudden, which last year it seemed like, or the last couple of years, it seemed like these jobs had drawn out long. A lot of teams getting it done early here, but there are a couple of ones still left. Of course, we'll keep you up to date on that. And then, of course, any Jim Schwartz name not getting mentioned at all, huh?
Yeah, pretty astonishing. I don't understand it, but if you look at the interviews and the hires, I mean, Vic Fangio is the only defensive guy to get hired. Very few even got interviews. Everybody's looking for the next Sean McVay. We kind of talked about it with Blake Kingsbury yesterday.
Yeah.
And even,
I think the Fangio hire is very, I mean, for Denver, who needs quarterback and offensive problems there, I thought going that route was kind of like Vance Joseph, but just with a more experienced version.
Well, yeah, I get what you're saying, but, you can go about these things in different ways. That's what I was kind of explaining with Cleveland. I don't see the necessity to promote Freddie Kitchens because he was already there. And you already saw what Greg Williams could at least do in a short sample size. And you just mentioned Gary Kubiak. I mean, Gary Kubiak's been a head coach in this league, a successful head coach, and that's your offensive mind. So just because you don't hire an offensive guy or vice versa, a defensive guy, doesn't mean you can't get it accomplished by hiring a good coordinator. So it's more than getting the head coach. It's getting the good coaching staff. And that's why I think, we always have worst to first in this league.
Always.
Already put a check mark next to Tampa because they hit a home run. they not only got a good coach in Bruce Arians, he got Todd Bowles back, so now they have a great defensive coordinator, and that's what he's best suited to do in this league.
Yep.
I think.
Right, and that division's starting to take a step back. Carolina's taking a step back. Atlanta's taking a step back. There's a spot there to jump into a wild card spot and then kind of, go toe-to-toe with New Orleans down the road.
Yeah, I think that team's going to make some noise immediately because they made the right hire, and I can't necessarily say that about a lot of the other organizations. And the second, I think, is the proven one is Denver because they got a proven defensive guy and a proven offensive guy.
And by the way, Dirk Cotter is back in Atlanta as the offensive coordinator. They fired Steve Sarkisian. He's out. Right.
Steve Sarkisian. Well, remember how good Matt Ryan was when Dirk Cotter was there the first time. So that should be a huge upgrade for Atlanta as well.
Off season's fun. Playoffs are fun. Being in the playoffs even better. We'll have more on the game tomorrow. John McMullen will be here at JF McMullen, always on Twitter, on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Thanks, pal.
All right, thanks, Mike.